Thank you so much for the warm introduction, Radhika, and thanks to the International Manifesto Group and all my co-panelists for making this event possible. I want to start off by acknowledging that since I drafted these prepared remarks about 2 weeks ago, many momentous events have transpired, most notably the global Samud flotilla, Trump's 20-point plan, its partial and provisional acceptance by the Palestinian resistance. Nonetheless, I believe the perspective I'm about to offer on the unique character of the Palestinian liberation struggle and the antinomies of formal statehood still holds true, and it will continue to do so no matter how the current conjuncture develops. So, with that said, I want to take us back to what seems like ancient history now, September 15th, when a week after ordering a flagrantly illegal airstrike on the Hamas office in Doha, Benjamin Netanyahu warned Israelis in a very interesting speech about their growing isolation and the need to become a militarily and economically self-sufficient, quasi-autarkic super Sparta. And in this speech, he accused two countries specifically of supposedly coordinating anti-Zionist influence operations through social media. One, of course, was Qatar, which he had just bombed. The other, rather more unusually, was China. And I think in his remarks, we can detect a sort of backhanded envy, actually, of China's technological self-sufficiency, especially in the digital domain, and perhaps even an implicit call for Israel to emulate its sovereign developmental model. Of course, such a vision would be entirely illusory because Israel is wholly reliant on the collective West and especially the US for the military-industrial superiority that undergirds its very survival as a settler colonial ethno-state. And of course, as I've written about elsewhere, China's path of sovereign development in the face of imperialist siege has a lot more relevance to the battered but still undefeated axis of resistance than it does to its enemies. Of course, among its members, the Gaza resistance led by Hamas, Ansarullah in Yemen are still actively fighting. Hezbollah is steadily rebuilding its arsenal, and Iran, of course, showed its ability to absolutely humiliate the US-Israeli war machine in the 12-day imposed war, all of this with indigenously produced weapons. But what I would like to discuss in greater detail today than we've so far published in Intel Collective is how China's historical trajectory of struggle informs its foreign policy vis-a-vis Palestine today, which I think many well-meaning people in the Solidarity movement may understandably criticize for its apparent limitations compared to the Mao period, especially now, 2 years into the most horrific genocide that most of us have ever witnessed. And I think it's important to contextualize all this in light of not just the historical arc of bilateral Palestine-China relations, but also the recently celebrated 80th anniversary of Japan's defeat in the World Anti-Fascist War, and also the conditional and purely symbolic recognition of the state of Palestine by 10 Western countries at the just concluded UN General Assembly. So to that end, we have to recognize in particular that the stages of China's long 20th century struggle for sovereignty and recognition do have obvious parallels, but also some important essential differences from the Palestinian one. In China's case, before 1949, you had semi-colonial subjugation, national disunity, and pretty much nonstop civil war, punctuated by just one period of nominally unified anti-colonial resistance against Japan from 1937 to 1945. And then from the revolution of 1949 onwards, for about 2 decades, you had, of course, national liberation, almost complete territorial unification through social revolution, which laid the foundations for real sovereignty, even under imperialist siege and exclusion from the Western-led global order. So that was what led into the 70s, where you then had progressive normalization with former imperialist enemies and colonizers, most notably Japan in 1971, and then the US in 1979. You had China's entry into the UN in 1971 and its growing diplomatic integration into the world order. And then basically from the start of the reform period onwards to the present, you had economic integration into the capitalist world system, but importantly, without compromising China's sovereign developmental prerogatives. And in those respects, I think we can, identify some key differences in the Palestinian experience, where in 1948, with the Nakba, and then following that, the Nakba of 1967, you had a near total loss of territorial sovereignty, which necessitated a long period of struggle, predominantly in exile. And then in 1988, you had the declaration and rapid recognition, initially by the socialist bloc in the global South, of a Palestinian state. But this was not accompanied by any recovery of real territorial sovereignty. And indeed, it paved the way for the official surrender of claims to 78% of historic Palestine in the Oslo Accords. It also led to the unreciprocated recognition of Israel and a stated commitment to the so-called two-state solution by the PLO, which of course opened the door for most of Palestine's diplomatic allies across the socialist and ex-socialist bloc and the global South to do so as well, including China, Vietnam, pretty much the entire former Soviet bloc and most African countries. And then to this day, this has led to a situation where the formal institutions of the state of Palestine are monopolized by an openly collaborationist regime, which directs its very limited firepower pretty much solely against the armed anti-Zionist resistance, with just a few notable exceptions, like during the Second Intifada. And I think this is really analogous to the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek in the period between 1932 and 1937, when it was exclusively fighting the Communist Party and not Japan, but with the proviso that the Palestinian Authority has no real territorial control whatsoever. So this analysis is, I think, increasingly predominant, not just in the Western solidarity movement, but also in Chinese popular discourse and civil society. We've documented this, for example, in our translation of Shattering the Iron Wall, which is a hugely popular Chinese analysis on the martyrdom of Yahya Sinwar. And no doubt the leadership is privately aware of that reality as well. But the fact is, I think that China's public positions and that of most of the global South are constrained by its formal relations with the actually existing state of Palestine and the need to treat it with its institutions as they exist as a normal state, right, whose independence and sovereignty are just as substantive as that of China or any other country. So under those limitations, nonetheless, I think there have been some clear signs of official Chinese recognition of the distinct conditions of the Palestinian struggle. And these are really important to highlight. One, of course, is China's strident refusal to delegitimize Hamas or other armed resistance groups as so-called terrorist groups. Rather, it embraces them as national liberation forces, as organic parts of the Palestinian polity. And it has refused to this day to overtly condemn Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. You also had early last year, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Ma Xinmin intervening overtly in support of the right to national liberation through armed struggle at the International Court of Justice. And then I think most notably last July 2024, you had the Beijing Declaration, which was negotiated and signed by 14 Palestinian factions in China, including both Hamas and Fatah, as well as pretty much all of the rest of the armed resistance groups. And I think the process leading up to this was doubtless informed by the CPC's own wartime experience of having to unite with erstwhile neutral or collaborationist forces, namely the Kuomintang, against Japan as a precondition for anti-colonial liberation. So all of this is to say that, when China officially refers to a two-state framework, which it still does, the Palestinian state that's envisioned there is one that has real territorial sovereignty, has the right of return to 48 Palestine, it has the capacity for armed self-defense, and it requires the democratic inclusion of all political factions, including armed resistance groups. And I think there's a world of difference between that vision and the honestly insulting, not to mention impracticable conditions on disarmament and exclusion of Hamas, which were the condition, right, that Western states imposed for their recent, highly symbolic and cynical recognitions of the state of Palestine. Nonetheless, there is, I think, an essential contradiction that's inherent to any two-state framework, which is that Israel, unlike, for example, Japan, is a settler colony that exists entirely on occupied Palestinian land. And because of that, the PLO's normalization with Israel in 1993 cannot be analogized in any way to the People's Republic of China's normalization with Japan in 1971, because the former ultimately marked a political defeat and an abrogation of sovereignty, whereas the latter was a political victory grounded in the affirmation of the PRC's sovereignty. Of course, China, under current conditions, can't openly acknowledge this at an official level, but I think we in the Solidarity movement can and must. That said, and I'm going to start wrapping up now. I think we can't ignore that China did have direct experience, not just of colonialism, but of settler colonialism specifically, namely the Japanese occupation of Northeast China, also known as Manchuria, from 1931 to 1945, whose anniversary we recently marked on September 18th. And I have a couple things to say about this. One is that, while distinct from the Zionist project in that it relied on enslavement rather than expulsion of the native population, and it, only lasted for 14 years rather than 77 plus, the Japanese colonization of Manchuria did involve the violent implantation of over 500,000 Japanese settlers. And it's true that the vast majority were quickly repatriated to the Japanese home islands after the Soviet Red Army liberated Manchuria in 1945 with crucial help from Chinese and Korean communists. But some settlers stayed behind, and their extraordinarily humane treatment from the CPC and from ordinary Chinese civilians, I think, is a story that is criminally underreported today. You had 4,000 Japanese orphans that were adopted into Chinese peasant families. You had Japanese prisoners of war captured by the communists who spoke almost uniformly of the extremely generous conditions of their captivity. Most successfully underwent non-coercive anti-imperialist re-education, and some even joined the victorious liberation struggle of the CPC. This is a story that I think has very few parallels in history, but by far the most relevant today is the extraordinarily humane treatment of Israeli captives by the Palestinian resistance in Gaza, which of course is grounded in Islamic principles. Just to wrap up, I want to note that ultimately the settler project in Manchuria collapsed almost overnight, but it did so only as a result of the total defeat of its imperial metropole, Japan, by an international coalition, in which China, of course, played a leading but by no means exclusive role. And to analogize that to the current situation, the closest analog to a metropole for the Zionist settler project is the collective West, and especially the US. Their global hegemony will be incomparably harder to overthrow than Japan's regional empire in World War II. But I think China and the rising tide of multipolarity are ineluctably creating the long-term conditions for the demise of that hegemony, albeit on a type scale that may seem agonizingly protracted given the urgency of the moment. So with that, I want to wrap up, and thank you again.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.